This is an overview of Topicality domestic versus the shop safe affirmative in the 2024-2025 NDCA novice packet. Before we look at this specific topicality argument, let's review what topicality is. Topicality is a negative off-case position, just like a disadvantage or a counterplan or a critique, but topicality says that the affirmative plan is not a part of the resolution. Something about the affirmative plan is not a part of the resolution that we've chosen to debate this year. Topicality is introduced in the 1NC, or the first negative constructive, just like other off-case positions. This year's resolution says that the United States federal government should significantly strengthen its protection of domestic intellectual property rights and copyrights, patents, and/or trademarks. So on topicality, the negative will argue that something about the plan does not have the United States federal government significantly strengthen its protection of domestic intellectual property rights in those three areas. There are generally four parts of a topicality shell. The interpretation is a description of what one or more of the words in the resolution means and usually has a definition to support that interpretation. Then the negative argues the violation, which is a short explanation of why the plan isn't a part of that interpretation. They're going to argue standards, which is the reasons the interpretation is good for debate. And finally, they're going to provide a voting issue, which is the argument that the affirmative should lose if they are not topical. Here are the negative arguments in this case. The interpretation is going to say that the word domestic in the resolution means that the intellectual property protection must be entirely within the bounds of the United States. It can't take place anywhere other than the United States. They're going to argue that there are parts of the Shop Safe Act that can be applied extraterritorially or outside of U.S. borders. There's going to be two standards arguments the negative is going to advance to why their interpretation is better for debate. The first is the concept of limits. In debate, limits means creating a topic that is small enough that the negative can reasonably be prepared to debate. The negative is going to argue here that the affirmative includes international law and treaties, which makes the topic way too big for the negative to be prepared to debate all those asks. The second key concept is ground. Ground means the negative's ability to access core topic arguments. In this case, the negative is going to argue that the affirmative would be able to claim specific country advantages to their international AFs, which the negative would not have disadvantages to. Finally, the negative is going to argue that this is a voting issue for fairness, to keep the debate reasonable between both sides, and education, so that both sides can learn about the core issues on this year's topic. The affirmative is then going to answer the topicality argument. The affirmative generally has four ways to answer topicality. They can make a we meet argument, saying that the plan doesn't actually violate the negative's interpretation. They can make a counter interpretation that says there's a different interpretation of the word the negative defined that the plan does meet. They're going to say that the judge should prefer their interpretation, and sometimes that's called counter standards, where they're going to say the affirmative's interpretation is better for debate than the negative's interpretation. And finally, they're going to make a reasonability argument. If the affirmative has a reasonable interpretation, the judge should prefer it. The we meet argument in this case is to say that the plan holds the platforms responsible. Those platforms are in the United States, even if some of the sellers are not. So to operate in the United States, eBay has a U.S. address, Amazon has a U.S. address, Etsy has a U.S. address. That means that holding those platforms responsible takes place in the United States, even if the counterfeited product is produced elsewhere. They're also going to have a counter interpretation that says legally, domestic means used in domestic commerce. That means sales to U.S. consumers are always domestic, even if the seller is overseas. The affirmative is going to have three reasons to prefer their interpretation. The first is a predictability argument. The affirmative's interpretation evidence is from the United States Supreme Court, so they're going to say that that should be what we prefer in debate. They're going to make a no limits and a no ground loss argument, that the affirmative's interpretation use in commerce limits out those treaties and international law and international advantages that the negative was complaining about. And they're going to make a topic education argument. They're going to say this is the core controversy in trademark law. ShopSafe is really the only thing Congress has considered doing about trademark law in the last few years, and so we should definitely allow this affirmative to be topical. Finally, they're going to make a reasonability argument. They're going to say competing interpretations, or the idea that the negative has to have the best interpretation and the affirmative has to have the best interpretation, and whoever has the better interpretation wins, causes a race to the bottom, meaning all we do is debate about topicality, and we have these self-serving definitions, which means we never get to debating whether the plan is a good idea or not. Instead, as long as the affirmative has a reasonable interpretation of the resolution, it doesn't have to be the best interpretation, it just has to be a reasonably good one, and then we should proceed to having a debate about the plan's advantages and disadvantages. If the negative decides to continue talking about topicality, they're going to extend the topicality argument in the negative block and eventually the 2 and R. They're going to respond to each of the affirmative's answers. And if the negative goes for topicality, they're probably going to do that for all 5 minutes of the 2 and R. The affirmative team is going to continue to respond to topicality if the negative continues to advance it, and the affirmative can pick and choose key arguments to beat the negative's thesis. That is, in order to win topicality, the negative has to beat each of the affirmative's arguments, whereas the affirmative only has to have 1 or 2 really good arguments to beat the topicality argument. I hope this has been helpful as you start debating topicality. Happy debating!